The dust settled around Ezra Coleman's boots as he dismounted his horse outside the trading post in Fort Bridger, Wyoming Territory. His weathered hands found the hitching post with practiced ease, fingers reading the wood grain like others read newspapers. 3 years of darkness had taught him to navigate by sound, smell, and memory. What he couldn't have anticipated was that this September morning in 1876 would change everything, that the woman he was about to purchase sight unseen would carry within her blood the key to a prophecy that would either save his soul or damn it forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other for Ezra Coleman. The rooster's crow penetrated the thin walls of his cabin at precisely 5:30, just as it had every day for the past 2 years since he'd settled on this patch of Wyoming territory. His calloused hands found the edge of his cot, and he swung, his legs to the wooden floor, feeling for the familiar grooves worn smooth by countless mornings, just like this one. Ezra's world existed in textures, sounds, and smells. The rough hemp of his work shirt, the metallic tang of the water pump outside his door, the sweet scent of prairie grass carried on the morning breeze. 3 years ago, a kick from a spooked Mustang had stolen his sight, but it had sharpened everything else to a razor's edge. He could tell when rain was coming 6 hours before the first cloud appeared, could identify a horse's breed by the sound of its hooves on different terrain, and could detect a man's intentions by the rhythm of his breathing. The accident had happened during a routine cattle drive from Texas to Montana. Ezra had been working for the Rocking H Ranch, one of the most respected outfits in the territory. He was their best horsebreaker, could gentle the wildest Mustang in half the time. It took other men. That particular morning, he'd been working with a black stallion that had been giving the crew trouble for weeks. The horse was magnificent, 17 hands high, with intelligence burning in its dark eyes and a spirit that refused to be broken. Everything had been going well. Ezra had spent hours in the corral with the stallion, moving slowly, speaking in low tones, building trust. The horse had finally allowed him to approach, had even accepted the halter without much fuss. But then a rattlesnake had slithered under the fence rails, its warning filling the air with deadly music. The stallion reared, striking out with hooves the size of dinner plates. Ezra tried to roll away, but he wasn't fast enough. The horse's iron shoe caught him square in the forehead, and the world exploded into white light before fading to permanent black. The months that followed were the darkest of Ezra's life, and not just because of the blindness. The Rocking H had paid for the best doctors money could buy, brought specialists from as far away as San Francisco. But the verdict was always the same. The damage to his optic nerves was complete and irreversible. At 28 years old, Ezra Coleman would never see another sunrise, never watch cattle move across an open range, never look into a woman's eyes and know if she truly loved him. Ranch foreman Jim Hawthorne had been good to him. Better than good. When it became clear that Ezra's days as a cowboy were over, Jim had helped him file a homestead claim on 160 acres of decent grazing land about 30 miles southeast of Fort Bridger. He'd even arranged for some of the boys to help build a cabin and set up a small operation. Ezra's savings, combined with a settlement from the ranch, gave him enough money to buy a dozen head of cattle and 2 good horses. But money couldn't buy what Ezra needed most: companionship. The isolation of frontier life was hard enough for a man with all his faculties. For a blind man, it was slowly becoming unbearable. His nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away, and the journey to Fort Bridger took the better part of a day. Weeks would pass without Ezra hearing another human voice, and he found himself talking to his cattle just to remember what conversation sounded like. He'd tried to court women in town, but the results were always the same. They'd be polite enough, at first even sympathetic to his condition, But when it came time for serious conversation about marriage and building a life together, they'd find excuses to leave. Ezra understood their reluctance. Life on the frontier was hard enough without taking on the burden of caring for a disabled husband. What woman wanted to spend her life guiding a blind man around his own property, reading his correspondence, handling all the business that required sight? The loneliness ate at him like acid. Some evenings, sitting on his porch and listening to the wind move through the grass, Ezra wondered if he wouldn't be better off putting his Colt .45 to his temple and ending the endless gray twilight that his life had become. The only thing that stopped him was stubbornness, the same iron will that had made him the best horsebreaker in 3 territories. It was Jim Hawthorne who suggested the mail-order bride. They were sitting in Murphy's saloon in Fort Bridger on a rare visit to town, sharing a bottle of whiskey and listening to the piano player massacre Buffalo Gals. Jim was one of the few people who treated Ezra the same as he always had, didn't speak louder or move slower, didn't act like blindness was contagious. "You know what your problem is, Easy," Jim said, refilling both their glasses. "You're trying to find a woman who'll take pity on you. That ain't what you need." "What I need is sight," Ezra replied, downing his whiskey in one burning gulp. "Hell, no. What you need is a woman who's got her own reasons for needing a husband. Someone who ain't looking for romance and pretty words. Someone who needs security and protection more than she needs a man who can see her face across the breakfast table." Jim went on to explain that there were dozens of women back east, widows mostly, who were looking for practical arrangements rather than love matches. Women who'd lost their husbands in the war or to disease, who had children to feed and no way to support them. Women who'd answer an advertisement for a wife if the man could offer them a roof over their heads and food on the table. "Put an ad in one of those Chicago papers," Jim suggested. "Be honest about your condition, but emphasize what you can offer. Good land, steady income, protection. Hell, Easy, you're still the finest man I know, blind or not. Any woman would be lucky to have you." Ezra had considered the idea for weeks before finally acting on it. He dictated a letter to the widow who ran the boarding house in Fort Bridger, Mrs. Patterson, asking her to place an advertisement in the Chicago Tribune and the Boston Herald. The ad was straightforward and honest. "Ranchers in Wyoming Territory seek wives for practical arrangements. The man is 28, owns 160 acres of good grazing land plus cattle and horses. Steady income and comfortable home assured. The applicant is blind due to an accident but fully capable of providing for family. Seeking a woman of good character who values security over romance. Children are welcome. Reply to E. Coleman, General. Delivery, Fort Bridger, Wyoming Territory." The responses had been fewer than he'd hoped, but more than he'd expected. 7 letters in total, ranging from a widow in Boston with 3 children to a young woman in Philadelphia whose father had gambled away the family farm. Each letter painted a picture of desperation wrapped in careful dignity. Women who needed a way out of impossible circumstances. But it was the 8th letter that changed everything. Though Ezra didn't know it at the time, Mrs. Patterson had been reading the correspondence to him in her parlor, her voice carefully neutral as she described each woman's situation. When she opened the final envelope, her voice caught slightly. "This one's different, Mr. Coleman," she said. "It's not from back east." The letter was written on expensive paper in an educated hand, but the return address was Fort Laramie, just 200 miles south. The writer identified herself as Catherine Morrison, and her story was unlike any of the others. "Mr. Coleman," the letter began, "I am responding to your advertisement not out of desperation, but out of necessity. I am 24 years old, educated, and capable of managing a household. I have no children, but am not opposed to having them. What makes my situation unique is that I am half Lakota Sioux, the daughter of a white trader and a woman of the Oglala band. This heritage makes me unmarriageable in conventional society, but it also provides me with skills that might prove valuable to a rancher. I can track game, preserve meat, identify medicinal plants, and survive in conditions that would defeat most Eastern women. The letter went on to explain that Catherine's father had died 6 months earlier, leaving her with no family among the whites and unable to return to her mother's people, who had long since moved north to the agencies. She was currently working as a seamstress in Fort Laramie, but the arrangement was temporary, and her employer had made it clear that her mixed heritage made customers uncomfortable. "I propose a business arrangement," the letter continued. "I will be a faithful wife and capable partner. In exchange, I ask only for respectability and security. I have no illusions about love, Mr. Coleman, but I believe we might build something worthwhile together. If you are interested, I can travel to Fort Bridger within the month." What struck Ezra most about the letter wasn't Catherine's mixed heritage. He'd known plenty of mixed-blood families during his cowboy days, and most were good people caught between two worlds. What impressed him was her honesty and the practical way she approached the situation. She wasn't asking for rescue or offering false promises of affection. She was proposing a partnership between two people who both had something to offer and something to gain. He dictated his response that same day, agreeing to her proposal and sending money for travel expenses. They'd exchanged 2 more letters, working out the practical details. Catherine would arrive in Fort Bridger on the September stage, and they would be married by the circuit judge who came through town twice a month. It was all very businesslike and civilized. What neither of them mentioned in their correspondence was the fear that kept both of them awake at night. Catherine feared that when Ezra learned the full truth about her heritage, that her mother had been not just Lakota, but a medicine woman, whose bloodline traced back to the most sacred prophecies of her people, he would reject her. Ezra feared that when Catherine saw him, truly saw him with his scarred forehead and sightless eyes, she would realize she'd made a terrible mistake. The morning of her arrival, Ezra had risen before dawn, unable to sleep. He'd shaved with particular care, cut his hair, and put on his best shirt, the blue one that Jim had told him brought out his eyes, though Ezra couldn't remember what color his eyes were anymore. He'd saddled Ranger, his most reliable horse, and made the journey to Fort Bridger in record time. The stage was due at noon, but Ezra arrived at Murphy's saloon by 10 o'clock, too nervous to wait at home. He ordered coffee and tried to eat the ham and eggs that Murphy set in front of him, but his stomach was twisted in knots. What if she took one look at him and climbed back on the stage? What if he'd built up expectations that no real woman could meet? What if this whole arrangement was the biggest mistake of his life? At 11:30, he heard the thunder of hooves and the jingle of harness that announced the stage's approach. Ezra finished his coffee, left money on the table, and made his way outside. A small crowd had gathered. The arrival of the stage was always an event in Fort Bridger, bringing news, supplies, and occasionally strangers with interesting stories to tell. The stage pulled up in a cloud of dust and creaking leather. Ezra positioned himself near the front of the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard the driver climb down, heard the metallic scrape of the door being opened. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Fort Bridger. The driver called out, 20-minute stop. Footsteps on the coach's wooden steps, the rustle of skirts, the soft thud of feet hitting the ground. A woman's voice, asking directions to Murphy's saloon. The voice was lower than he'd expected, with a slight accent that spoke of education and careful diction, but underneath, it was something else, the musical cadence of a language not quite forgotten. "Catherine Morrison?" Ezra called out, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. "Mr. Coleman?" She was walking toward him now, her footsteps sure and steady on the dusty street. Ezra caught a whiff of her scent soap and lavender water, but Underneath that something wilder, like sage in the wind. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Ezra Coleman." She stopped just in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body. There was a moment of silence that stretched between them like a held breath. "You're exactly as I pictured you," she said finally, and there was something in her voice that might have been relief. "I wish I could say the same," Ezra replied then. Immediately cursed himself for the awkward joke, but Catherine laughed, a genuine sound that eased some of the tension in his chest. "Perhaps that's for the best, Mr. Coleman. I've been told I'm not what most people expect. Call me Ezra, and I reckon we're both exactly what the other needs, even if we don't know it yet." They were married 3 hours later in the parlor of the boarding house, with Mrs. Patterson and Jim Hawthorne serving as witnesses. The circuit judge, a portly man named Brennan, who'd performed dozens of these practical marriages, kept the ceremony short and to the point. Ezra had bought a simple gold band from the trading post, and Catherine had accepted it with quiet dignity. What Ezra couldn't see, but what everyone else in the room noticed, was that Catherine wore a dark veil that completely obscured her features. When Judge Brennan asked her to lift it for the ceremony, she'd quietly but firmly refused, saying it was a cultural tradition that she couldn't break until sunset on her wedding day. The judge shrugged and proceeded with the vows. He'd seen stranger things on the frontier. As they prepared to leave Fort Bridger for Ezra's ranch, Catherine helped him load her few possessions into the wagon he'd borrowed for the occasion. Her belongings were sparse: a trunk containing clothes and personal items, a bundle wrapped in what felt like deerskin, and a leather satchel that clinked softly when she lifted it. "That's everything?" Ezra asked. "I believe in traveling light," Catherine replied. "Most of what matters can't be packed in a trunk anyway." The journey to the ranch took 4 hours, riding slowly to accommodate the wagon's heavy wheels on the rough trail. They talked little during the trip, both lost in their own thoughts about what they'd just committed to. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people taking each other's measure, learning the rhythm of their breathing, the way they moved in space. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors Ezra could no longer see, but could feel in the cooling air, they arrived at his property. Catherine climbed down from the wagon without assistance, her movements graceful and sure. Ezra unhitched the horses and led them to the corral while Catherine surveyed her new home. The cabin was modest but well built, with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that faced east toward the sunrise. There was a small barn, a chicken coop, and a vegetable garden that Ezra had maintained as best he could. The whole operation was neat and functional, the work of a man who might not be able to see his surroundings, but who took pride in keeping them orderly. "It's perfect," Catherine said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. They were standing on the porch now, the evening air cooling around them. Ezra could hear his cattle lowing in the distance, the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the whisper of wind through the grass. These were the sounds of home, the audio landscape that had become as familiar to him as sight had once been. "Catherine," he said, turning toward where he thought she was standing, "I want you to know that I don't expect. That is, I don't assume that just because we're married." "I know," she said softly. "We're partners first. Everything else can wait until we know each other better." Relief flooded through him. He'd been worried about this moment, about her expectations and his own limitations. The marriage might have been arranged for practical reasons, but he was still a man, and she was still a woman, and there were certain assumptions that came with the territory. "There's something I need to tell you," Catherine said, and her voice carried a weight that made Ezra's stomach tighten. "Something I didn't put in my letters. What is it?" He heard the rustle of fabric, the soft whisper of material being moved. She was removing her veil, he realized. In the growing darkness, it wouldn't matter that he couldn't see her face, but the gesture itself was significant. "My mother's name was Ayanna," Catherine said. It means eternal blossom in Lakota. She was a medicine woman, a keeper of the old prophecies. Before she died, she told me that I would one day meet a man who lived in darkness, but who would see more clearly than anyone around him. She said that our coming together would fulfill an ancient promise, that together we would heal something that had been broken for generations. Ezra felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. What kind of prophecy? The prophecy of the blind seer and the bridge walker, Catherine said. My mother's grandmother told it to her, and her grandmother's grandmother told it to her, going back 7 generations. It speaks of 2 people from different worlds who would find each other in the time of great change, when the old ways were dying and the new ways were not yet born. The man would be one who had lost his outer sight but gained inner vision. The woman would be one who walked between worlds, belonging fully to neither, but understanding both. She paused, and Ezra could hear her breathing, steady but careful, as if she were walking across thin ice. There's more, she continued. The prophecy says that their union would restore balance, that the man's darkness would be healed, not by regaining his sight, but by learning to see in a new way. And the woman would find her true home not in choosing between her 2 heritages, but in bridging them. Ezra stood silent for a long moment, processing what she'd told him. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as superstition, the kind of mystical thinking that often arose in cultures struggling to make sense of a changing world. But another part of him, the part that had learned to navigate by instincts and intuition, recognized something significant in Catherine's words. Do you believe it? He asked finally. I didn't, Catherine admitted. Not until I read your advertisement. The way you described yourself, a man who had lost his sight, but was still capable of providing for a family, it was exactly what my mother had told me to watch for. And when your letter arrived, I felt something I hadn't felt since my parents died. I felt like I was finally moving toward my true purpose. They went inside then, and Catherine began to unpack her belongings while Ezra built up the fire. The domesticity of it felt strange and familiar at the same time, like putting on clothes that had been tailored for someone else but fit perfectly anyway. Catherine moved around the cabin with surprising ease, as if she'd been living there for years rather than hours. You're remarkably comfortable here, Ezra observed as he listened to her efficient movements. I spent a lot of time in places like this when I was young, Catherine explained. My father was a trader, and we lived in a dozen different cabins and trading posts before I was 10 years old. You learn to adapt quickly. As the evening wore on, they fell into an easy conversation about practical matters, the ranch, the cattle, the coming winter. Catherine asked intelligent questions about the operation, and Ezra found himself appreciating her quick grasp of the challenges he faced. She understood immediately why certain tasks were difficult for him and began suggesting modifications that would make his work easier without making him feel helpless. Tomorrow I'd like to walk the property with you, she said as they prepared to retire to their separate sleeping areas, Ezra to his room, Catherine to a bedroll by the fireplace until they could build her a proper space. I want to understand the land, see where we might make improvements. We? Ezra asked. We're partners now, remember? Your success is my success, and vice versa. That night, as Ezra lay in his narrow bed, listening to Catherine's soft breathing from the main room, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years' hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man reaching for driftwood, but the solid, practical hope of a man who suddenly saw possibilities where before there had been only limitations. What he didn't know, as sleep finally claimed him, was that in the main room Catherine lay awake, staring at the dying embers of the fire, her fingers tracing the intricate beadwork on a medicine bag her mother had given her years before. Inside the bag were sacred items, a piece of meteorite, herbs that grew only in the sacred Black Hills, and a small carving made from the horn of a white buffalo that had been seen once in her great-grandmother's time, The prophecy was more complex than she'd told Ezra, more dangerous and more promising than either of them yet understood. According to the ancient words passed down through 7 generations of medicine women, the coming together of the blind seer and the bridge walker would indeed restore sight, but not in the way anyone expected. The healing would come through shared vision, through the joining of 2 different ways of seeing the world. But the prophecy also warned of trials to come, tests that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. Forces would try to drive them apart, both from the white world that saw their union as unnatural and from elements within the Lakota community, who viewed any mixing of bloodlines as a betrayal of the old ways. Catherine closed her eyes and whispered a prayer in the language her mother had taught her, asking for strength and wisdom in the days to come. She'd found the man from the prophecy, but finding him was only the beginning. Now came the harder task, learning to truly see together and discovering what it meant to heal not just themselves, but the broken places where 2 worlds collided. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and the distant howl of wolves. Winter was approaching, and with it would come the first real test of their unusual partnership. Neither Ezra nor Catherine knew it yet, but their story was just beginning, and the forces that would shape their destiny were already moving across the vast Wyoming landscape like shadows in the moonlight. The first snows came early that year, dusting the Wyoming territory in late October with a promise of the harsh winter to come. Ezra woke to the familiar silence that meant snow had fallen during the night, that peculiar quiet when sound itself seemed muffled and distant. But this morning was different. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't alone with the silence. Catherine had been living at the ranch for 6 weeks now, and her presence had transformed not just the cabin, but Ezra's entire world. She moved through their shared space with an efficiency that amazed him, anticipating needs he didn't even know he had. The coffee was always ready when he woke. His tools were organized in ways that made sense to his searching fingers. And somehow she'd managed to expand their modest vegetable garden to produce enough preserved food to last through the harshest winter. But it was her voice that had become most precious to him. Catherine read to him in the evenings, not just newspapers and correspondence, but books she'd brought from Fort Laramie. Her reading voice was different from her speaking voice. More musical, as if the words carried melodies her Lakota heritage had woven into English. She read adventure stories by Jules Verne, poetry by Walt Whitman, and practical articles from farming journals that helped him understand new techniques for managing his small herd. This particular morning, as Ezra pulled on his boots and prepared to check on the cattle, he heard Catherine moving around the kitchen with unusual urgency. There was something different in her movements, a tension that set his nerves on edge. "Storm coming," she said without preamble when he entered the main room. "Big one. We have maybe 6 hours before it hits." Ezra paused, listening to the air, with the heightened attention that blindness had taught him. The wind had shifted during the night, coming now from the northwest with a bite that spoke of Arctic air masses colliding over the high plains. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite identify. "How do you know?" he asked. "The horses told me first," Catherine replied, and he could hear her moving around the room, gathering supplies. "They're restless, bunching up near the barn instead of grazing. Then I checked the sky. There's a wall of clouds moving in from the north, dark as night and moving fast. But mostly, I know because my bones know. My mother taught me to read weather the way white men read books." Ezra nodded. He'd learned to trust Catherine's instincts about such things. In the weeks since her arrival, she'd proven remarkably accurate at predicting everything from sudden temperature drops to the exact day the first hard freeze would kill their remaining garden vegetables. "What do we need to do?" he asked. "Everything," Catherine said grimly. "This isn't going to be just a snowstorm, Ezra. This is going to be one of those storms that people talk about for years afterward. We need to get the cattle into the shelter pasture, Make sure we have enough firewood stacked inside to last a week, and prepare for the possibility that we might not be able to get to the barn for days." They worked through the morning with desperate efficiency. Catherine had already saddled both horses by the time Ezra finished his breakfast, and together they rode out to gather the scattered cattle. Ezra's blindness, which had seemed like such a liability during his first months on the ranch, had become less of a hindrance as he learned to work with Catherine. She became his eyes, calling out directions and obstacles, while his superior hearing often picked up the sound of cattle moving through brush that she couldn't see. "3 head by the creek bed," Catherine called out as they worked to round up the herd, "moving away from us toward those rocks." Ezra guided Ranger toward the sound of lowing cattle, his horse responding to the subtle pressure of his knees and the shift of his weight in the saddle. Years of cowboy work had made this kind of riding second nature, and blindness hadn't taken away his ability to sense a horse's movements and anticipate its reactions. But as they worked, Ezra began to notice something unusual. Catherine's directions were becoming more precise, more detailed than they'd been before. Instead of simply telling him where the cattle were, she was describing their behavior, their apparent mood, even individual animals he'd never mentioned. To her, the red cow with the white face, the one you call Bessie, she's favoring her left front hoof, Catherine called out as they herded the last stragglers toward the shelter pasture. Probably picked up a stone. And that young bull, the one with the notched ear, he's acting protective of the smaller cattle. Storm's got them all spooked, Ezra frowned. He'd never told Catherine about his naming system for the cattle, and he was certain he'd never mentioned Bessie's distinctive markings or the young bull's notched ear. Yet she was describing them with the accuracy of someone who'd been studying the herd for months. "Catherine," he said as they secured the gate to the shelter pasture, "how do you know so much about my cattle?" There was a pause before she answered, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of uncertainty he'd rarely heard from her. "I've been watching them," she said, "learning their habits, their personalities. It's important to know the animals you depend on." It was a reasonable answer, but something in her tone suggested there was more to it than simple observation. Ezra filed the question away for later consideration. Right now they had more pressing concerns. The wind was picking up as they rode back to the cabin, and Ezra could feel the temperature dropping with each gust. By the time they reached the barn, the first fat snowflakes were beginning to fall, drifting down like white ash from the sky. He couldn't see but could feel pressing down on them like a physical weight. They spent the next 2 hours moving firewood from the woodshed to the cabin, stacking it as high as they could against the interior walls. Catherine had also insisted on bringing several bales of hay into the cabin's main room, over Ezra's protests about the mess. "If this storm is as bad as I think it's going to be," she explained as they wrestled the heavy bales through the doorway, "we might need to bring the horses inside. Better to have the hay ready than to try to get to the barn in a blizzard." By mid-afternoon, the snow was falling steadily, and the wind had risen to a constant howl that made conversation difficult. Catherine moved around the cabin with increasing urgency, checking and double-checking their preparations. She'd filled every available container with water, moved their entire food supply into the main room, and even brought in armloads of the medicinal herbs she'd been gathering and drying since her arrival. "There's something else," she said as they sat down to what might be their last hot meal for several days. "Something I need to tell you about the storm." Ezra looked up from his plate, fork halfway to his mouth. "What about it?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and he could hear her fingers drumming nervously on the wooden table. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "This isn't just any storm, Ezra. This is the storm my mother warned me about. She called it the White Death, the test that would come before the prophecy could be fulfilled." "What kind of test?" Ezra asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The prophecy says that the blind seer and the bridge walker would face 3 trials together. The first would be a test of survival, when they would be trapped together and forced to depend completely on each other. The second would be a test of trust, when secrets would be revealed and they would have to choose whether to stand together or fall apart. The third would be a test of purpose, when they would have to decide what they were willing to sacrifice for each other and for their shared destiny. Ezra set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. "And you think this storm is the first test?" "I know it is," Catherine said. "Because this morning, when I woke up, I could see things I've never been able to see before. Not just the storm coming, but other things. I could see the cattle as clearly as if I was standing next to them, even when they were miles away. I could see the patterns of the wind, the exact path the storm would take. And I could see something else, something that scared me more than the weather." "What?" "Men on horseback, riding hard toward our ranch. They'll arrive just as the storm hits, maybe a little after. And they're not coming to help." Ezra felt his blood turn to ice water. "Who are they?" "I don't know for certain. But I saw enough to know they're white men, armed and angry about something. And I think I think they know about me, about what I am." As if summoned by her words, a sound cut through the howling wind, the distant crack of a rifle shot, then another. Ezra was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun belt he wore even inside the cabin. "How many?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I can't tell exactly. At least 6, maybe more. They're about 2 miles out, coming from the east." Catherine's voice had changed, becoming flatter, more distant, as if she was seeing something far away. It was the same tone she'd used when describing the storm's approach, and Ezra realized with a start that she wasn't guessing about the riders. She was somehow actually seeing them. "Can you still see them now?" he asked. "Yes, they've stopped." "At the ridge above Miller's Creek, the one in front, he's older. Gray beard, wearing a cavalry coat but no uniform underneath. He's got a paper in his hand, reading it to the others." Ezra's mind raced. Miller's Creek was exactly 2 miles east of his ranch, and the ridge Catherine described was the high ground that overlooked his entire spread. If someone wanted to scout his property before approaching, that's exactly where they'd stop. "What else do you see?" "They're arguing about something. The older man wants to wait until after the storm passes, but some of the younger ones want to come down now. There's a lot of anger in their voices, even though I can't hear the words." Catherine paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was tight with fear. "Ezra, I think they're here because of me. I think someone in Fort Laramie told them about our marriage, about what I am. There are people who don't like the idea of white men marrying Indian women, even half-Indian women. And there are others who think mixed-blood people are dangerous, that we're some kind of threat to their way of life." Ezra moved to the window, though he couldn't see through it. His hands found the familiar weight of his rifle, and he checked the action by feel, making sure it was loaded and ready. "It doesn't matter why they're here," he said. "This is our home, and you're my wife. That's all that matters." But even as he spoke the words, Ezra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. He'd heard stories about vigilante groups that rode through the territories, taking the law into their own hands when they felt the authorities weren't acting quickly enough. Most of their targets were cattle rustlers and claim jumpers, but there had been darker incidents: Indian families driven from their homes, mixed-blood settlers forced to abandon property they'd legally claimed. "They're moving again," Catherine said, her voice distant and strange, "coming down from the ridge. But the storm's hitting them hard now. They can barely see 10 feet in front of their horses." As if to confirm her words, the wind outside suddenly intensified, rattling the cabin's windows and sending a cascade of snow down the chimney to hiss in the fireplace. The blizzard had arrived in earnest, and visibility outside would be reduced to almost nothing. "That might work in our favor," Ezra said. "If they can't see where they're going, they might get lost or decide to turn back." But Catherine shook her head, though he couldn't see the gesture. "They won't turn back. The older man I can see his face clearly now, and there's too much hate there. This isn't just about enforcement of some law. This is personal for him." She was quiet for a moment, and Ezra could hear her moving around the room, gathering things with the same efficient urgency she'd shown earlier. "There's something else," she said finally. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, but I was afraid you'd send me away." Ezra turned toward her, voice, his hand still gripping his rifle. "Tell me now." "My father wasn't just a traitor, Ezra. He was Thomas Morrison, and for 10 years he was the Indian agent at Fort Laramie. He made a lot of enemies during that time, white settlers who thought he was too sympathetic to the tribes, military officers who wanted him to be harder on the people living on the reservation, politicians who thought he was standing in the way of territorial expansion." The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. Every man who'd worked cattle in Wyoming Territory knew about Thomas Morrison. He'd been one of the most controversial figures in the region's recent history, a white man who'd married a Lakota woman and spent years trying to broker peace between the two cultures. His efforts had earned him enemies on both sides, and his death 6 months earlier had been the subject of considerable speculation. Some said he'd died of natural causes, but others whispered about poison or a knife in the dark. "Morrison," Ezra repeated. "Jesus Christ, Catherine, do you know what you've brought to my door?" "I know exactly what I've brought," Catherine said, and there was steel in her voice now. "I've brought you a chance to be part of something bigger than just surviving on a homestead. My father spent his life trying to build bridges between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. When he died, that work didn't die with him. It passed to me." She moved closer to him, and he could feel the intensity radiating from her like heat from a forge. "The prophecy isn't just about healing your sight, Ezra. It's about healing the rift between cultures, about showing that people from different worlds can not only coexist, but make each other stronger. But that kind of change always comes with a price. There are people who profit from hatred and division, and they'll do anything to stop what we represent." Before Ezra could respond, the sound of horses' hooves cut through the storm's howl. Catherine moved to the window, and he could hear her breathing change as she peered out into the swirling snow. "They're here," she whispered. "6 men, just like I saw. They're dismounting by the corral, trying to figure out their next move." Ezra moved to join her at the window, his rifle ready. "Can you see their faces?" "The older man with the gray beard, his name is Colonel Nathaniel Hayes. He used to be my father's superior at Fort Laramie before he was discharged for excessive force against reservation families. He's been looking for a reason to come after my father's family ever since." "How do you know his name?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Because I can see his thoughts, Ezra, just like I could see the storm coming and the cattle's behavior. Since I've been here with you, since we spoke the marriage vows, my mother's gifts have been getting stronger. I can see things that haven't happened yet, know things I shouldn't know." A loud banging on the cabin door interrupted their conversation, followed by a voice that carried easily over the wind. "Morrison woman, we know you're in there. Come out and face justice for your father's crimes." Ezra positioned himself beside the door, his rifle aimed at chest height. "What crimes?" He called back. "Your woman's father was a traitor to his own race." Hayes shouted. "He sold weapons to hostiles, passed information about troop movements, helped renegade bands escape justice. And now his half-breed daughter is carrying on his work." Thomas Morrison was investigated by the territorial government and cleared of all charges, Ezra replied. "You've got no authority here, Hayes." There was a pause, then the sound of men conferring in urgent whispers. Catherine moved away from the window, and Ezra could hear her doing something at the back of the cabin. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "Getting ready for what comes next," she replied. "They're not going to leave just because you ask them to. Hayes has been planning this for months, waiting for the right opportunity. A blizzard that will cover their tracks. A remote ranch where no one will hear gunshots or find bodies until spring. As if to prove her point, the sound of breaking glass came from the back of the cabin, followed by the acrid smell of kerosene. Someone had thrown a burning bottle through the rear window. "Fire!" Catherine called out, but her voice was strangely calm. "They're trying to burn us out." Ezra could hear flames crackling against the cabin's rear wall, but instead of panic, he felt a strange sense of clarity settle over him. This was it, the moment that would define not just their marriage, but their entire future together. They could surrender and hope for mercy they probably wouldn't receive, or they could fight and trust in each other completely. "Catherine," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them, "I need you to be my eyes now. Can you do that?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "Then tell me exactly what you see, and we'll show these bastards what happens when they threaten our home." The fire was spreading quickly along the cabin's back wall, and smoke was beginning to fill the room. Outside, Ezra could hear Hayes shouting orders to his men, positioning them around the cabin to catch anyone who tried to escape the flames. But what Hayes didn't know, what none of the attackers could have anticipated, was that Catherine Morrison Coleman was no ordinary woman. The gifts her mother had passed down to her, dormant for years while she lived among white society, had awakened fully in the past weeks. And now, with her husband's life hanging in the balance, those gifts were about to reveal their true power. 3 men at the front of the cabin, Catherine said, her voice taking on that distant, seeing quality. Hayes in the center, 2 younger men flanking him. 2 more at the north side, watching the windows. 1 at the south side, and he's the one who threw the fire bottle. Weapons, all armed with rifles. Hayes has a pistol as well. The man on the south side is reloading. He's planning to throw another fire bottle. Ezra nodded, his mind calculating angles and possibilities. The front door was solid oak and would provide some cover when opened. The main room had furniture they could use for additional protection. And if Catherine's enhanced vision was as accurate as it seemed to be, they might have an advantage that would offset the odds against them. "When I open this door," he said, "I want you to tell me exactly where to aim. Don't think about whether I can hit what I can't see. Just trust that I can do this." Catherine moved to his side, and he could feel her presence like warmth in the smoky air. "I trust you completely," she said. Ezra took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and threw open the cabin door. The battle that followed would be talked about in saloons and trading posts across Wyoming territory for years to come. Witnesses would swear that the blind cowboy and his half-Indian wife fought like they shared a single mind, that his shots found targets he couldn't possibly see while she seemed to know exactly where every attacker was positioned, even when they were hidden behind cover. But those who told the story never understood the real truth, that in that moment, facing death together, Ezra and Catherine had achieved the first stage of the ancient prophecy. They had learned to see with shared vision, to fight as one person in 2 bodies, to trust each other with a faith that transcended the ordinary bonds of marriage. The storm raged around them, the fire spread behind them, and their enemies closed in from all sides. But for the first time since losing his sight, Ezra Coleman could see clearly. And what he saw, through Catherine's extraordinary gift, was the path to survival. The first shot came from Catherine's directions, Ezra's rifle barking in the frigid air as his bullet found Hayes's left shoulder, spinning the older man around and sending him stumbling backward into the snow. But there was no time to celebrate the hit muzzle. Flashes erupted from 3 different positions as the attackers returned fire, wood splinters exploding from the doorframe inches from Ezra's head. "Down and left," Catherine called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The man by the water trough, he's aiming at your chest." Ezra dropped to one knee and fired in a single fluid motion. A scream pierced the storm's howl, followed by the metallic clang of a rifle hitting the ground. 1 down, 5 to go, but the fire behind them was spreading faster than they'd anticipated. The entire back wall of the cabin was now engulfed in flames, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Smoke filled the room, making it hard to breathe and impossible for normal eyes to see clearly. Yet Catherine's supernatural vision seemed unaffected by the chaos. "We can't stay here much longer," she said, coughing as she spoke. "The roof timbers are starting to catch." "Where are the others positioned?" Ezra asked, quickly reloading his rifle by feel. 2 on the north side, behind your woodpile. 1 south, near the chicken coop. Hayes is wounded but still in the fight. He's crawled behind the water trough with the man you shot. The 6th man, I can't see him clearly. He's moving, trying to circle around behind us." A burning ember fell from the ceiling, landing on Ezra's shoulder and singeing his shirt before he could brush it away. The cabin was becoming a death trap, but stepping outside would expose them to crossfire from multiple directions. "Catherine," he said, his mind racing through possibilities, "can you see the barn from here?" "Yes, but it's 50 yards through open ground. They'd cut us down before. We made it halfway. Not if we give them something else to worry about." Ezra reached for one of the kerosene lamps that lit their evening meals. "Can you guide me to throw this at the woodpile where those 2 men are hiding?" Catherine understood immediately. "Wait for my signal. You'll need to throw it high and to the right to clear the porch overhang." Ezra hefted the lamp, feeling its weight and the slosh of fuel inside. He'd have one chance to get this right. If he missed, they'd lose their only source of distraction, and probably their lives along with it. "Now!" Catherine shouted. Ezra hurled the lamp with all his strength, following Catherine's directions precisely. The glass shattered against the woodpile with a satisfying crash, and within seconds the seasoned timber erupted in flames. Shouts of alarm came from the 2 men who'd been using the pile for cover as they scrambled away from the sudden inferno. "They're running toward the corral," Catherine called out. Both of them, moving fast. But even as she spoke, Ezra heard a new sound that made his blood freeze, the crack of burning wood above their heads. A section of the cabin's roof was starting to collapse. "Move!" he shouted, grabbing Catherine's hand and pulling her toward the door. They burst out of the burning cabin together, Ezra's rifle ready despite his inability to see their attackers. But Catherine's gift guided him with supernatural precision. As they ran toward the barn, she called out targets and directions with the calm efficiency of a military spotter. Hayes 40 yards straight ahead, rising up from behind the trough. Ezra's shot took the former colonel in the leg, dropping him back down behind cover. 2 men by the corral, both aiming at us. 2 quick shots from Ezra's rifle sent both attackers diving for better cover, their return fire going wide in their haste to avoid his bullets. But they were still 50 yards from the barn, and the snow was deep enough to slow their progress. Worse, the man Catherine couldn't see clearly had finally revealed himself, emerging from behind the chicken coop with a clear shot at their exposed flank. "Behind us!" Catherine screamed, but even as she spoke, the hidden attacker's rifle cracked. The bullet meant for Ezra struck Catherine in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her sprawling into the snow. Blood spread across her white shirt like spilled wine, dark and ominous in the firelight from their burning home. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Ezra heard Catherine's gasp of pain, felt her hand slip from his, and experienced a rage unlike anything he'd known since losing his sight. World around him crystallized into perfect, deadly focus. "Where is he?" Ezra asked, his voice deadly calm despite the fury burning in his chest. Catherine struggled to sit up in the snow, her left hand pressed against her wounded shoulder. When she spoke, her voice was tight with pain but steady with purpose. "Behind the chicken coop, 20 yards south. He's reloading. You have maybe 3 seconds before he fires again." Ezra turned toward the chicken coop and fired 3 times in rapid succession, working the rifle's lever action with mechanical precision. The first shot splintered wood. The second drew a yelp of surprise. The third was followed by a heavy thud and then silence. "Got him," Catherine confirmed, and there was satisfaction in her voice despite her injury, but their situation was still desperate. The cabin was now fully engulfed in flames, lighting up the night like a beacon. Catherine was losing blood, and they were still pinned down by at least 3 armed men who showed no signs of retreating. "Can you make it to the barn?" Ezra asked, helping Catherine to her feet. She leaned against him heavily, and he could feel her trembling from shock and cold. "I think so, but Ezra, there's something else. Something I'm seeing now that changes everything." "What?" "More riders. Coming from the east. At least a dozen men, maybe more. They'll be here within the hour." Ezra's heart sank. If Hayes had brought reinforcements, their chances of survival were virtually non-existent. But Catherine wasn't finished. "They're not with Hayes," she continued, her voice taking on that distant, prophetic quality again. "These are different men. Some are white, some are Indian, and they're armed for war." Before Ezra could ask what she meant, a new voice cut through. "The storm not Hayes or any of his men, but someone else entirely. Coleman, you and your woman come out with your hands up. We're federal marshals, and you're under arrest." Ezra felt Catherine stiffen beside him. "That's Marshal Garrett from Cheyenne," she whispered. "But he's not here to arrest us. He's here because of what my father discovered before he died." "What did your father discover?" "That Hayes and men like him weren't just vigilantes acting on their own. They were being paid by territorial politicians who wanted to drive all the mixed-blood families out of Wyoming. My father had evidence, names, dates, payments. He was going to expose the whole conspiracy to the federal government." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place for Ezra. "And when your father died, you inherited that evidence, along with the responsibility to see justice done. That's the real reason Hayes wants me dead, not just revenge for my father's policies, but to keep his secrets buried." Marshal Garrett called out again, his voice closer now. "Hayes, federal warrant here for your arrest on charges of conspiracy and murder. Surrender your weapons and come out peacefully." The response came in the form of rifle fire as Hayes and his remaining men opened up on the approaching lawmen. But their position was hopeless, caught between the marshals, approaching from one direction, and Ezra and Catherine holding the high ground near the barn. "It's over, Hayes," Garrett shouted over the gunfire. "Thomas Morrison's evidence has been presented to a federal grand jury in Denver. We know about the payments, the forged documents, the intimidation campaigns. Surrender now, and you might live to see trial." But Hayes was beyond rational thought. Years of hatred and the pain from his wounds had driven him to the edge of madness. His voice, when it came, was filled with venom. "I'll see every half-breed and Indian lover in this territory dead before I surrender to federal interference." The battle that followed was brief, but vicious. Hayes and his 2 remaining men made a desperate charge toward the barn, hoping to use Ezra and Catherine as hostages to bargain their way out of the trap. But they hadn't counted on the supernatural partnership that had already saved the couple once that night. Catherine, despite her wound, continued to guide Ezra's shots with uncanny precision. Her enhanced vision penetrated the swirling snow and darkness as if it were broad daylight, allowing Ezra to place his bullets exactly where they needed to go. When Hayes himself appeared out of the storm, his pistol aimed at Catherine's head, Ezra's final shot took him in the chest, dropping him into the snow where he lay still. The remaining attackers, seeing their leader fall and faced with superior numbers of federal marshals, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Marshal Garrett approached them cautiously, his own weapon still drawn until he could assess the situation. He was a tall, lean man with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years tracking fugitives across the frontier. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, tipping his hat respectfully to Catherine despite her obvious Indian heritage. "I'm glad to see you're alive. Your father's final letter reached our office 3 weeks ago, along with all his evidence against Hayes's conspiracy." Catherine looked up from where Ezra was trying to bandage her shoulder wound with strips torn from his shirt. "My father wrote to you before he died?" "He suspected someone was going to kill him," Garrett explained. "The letter was sealed and marked to be opened only in the event of his death. When we received word that he'd passed away, we opened it and found enough evidence to hang a dozen men. Hayes was just the beginning." As the marshal's men secured the prisoners and began the grim work of dealing with the dead, Garrett knelt beside Catherine and Ezra. His expression was serious but respectful. "Ma'am, I need to ask you about something your father mentioned in his letter. He wrote that you had inherited more than just his evidence, that you had certain abilities. That might be important to preventing future violence between whites and Indians." Catherine exchanged a glance with Ezra, and he could feel her uncertainty. How much should they reveal about the prophecy, about her growing supernatural gifts? "My mother was a medicine woman," Catherine said carefully. "She taught me to see things that others miss. That's how we knew you were coming tonight, how we were able to survive Hayes's attack." Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "Your father wrote that you might be key to preventing a larger war that's brewing. There's been talk among some of the reservation tribes about rising up against the government. At the same time, there are groups of white settlers organizing to drive all Indians out of the territory permanently. Your father believed that someone who understood both worlds might be able to prevent a bloodbath." Before Catherine could respond, one of the marshal's deputies approached with urgent news. "Marshal, we've got a problem. Scouts report 2 large groups of armed men moving toward this area. One appears to be a war party of Lakota warriors. The other is a militia force of white settlers. Best estimates put them both about 10 miles out, and they're heading straight for each other." Garrett cursed under his breath. "How many in each group?" "At least 50 warriors, maybe more. The militia force looks to be about the same size. If they meet, it's going to be a massacre on both sides." Catherine struggled to her feet, ignoring Ezra's attempts to keep her still. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes burned with intensity. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is what my mother's prophecy was really about. Not just healing Ezra's sight, but preventing a war that would destroy both our peoples." "Catherine, you're wounded and exhausted," Ezra protested. "You can't possibly." "I can and I must," she interrupted. "Don't you see? Everything that's happened tonight, everything we've been through together, it was all leading to this moment. The prophecy said that the blind seer and the bridge walker would be tested 3 times. We survived the first test here tonight. But the real test is coming." Marshal Garrett looked between them, confusion clear on his face. "What are you talking about?" "My wife has a gift," Ezra said simply. "She can see things before they happen, understand things that others can't. If she says there's a way to prevent this war, then I believe her." Catherine turned to face the marshal, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed to come from generations of medicine women before her. "Marshal Garrett, I need you to do exactly what I tell you. Send riders to both groups, 1 to the Lakota War Party, 1 to the militia. Tell them that Catherine Morrison Coleman, daughter of Thomas Morrison and granddaughter of the medicine woman, Ayanna, requests a parley at dawn on the neutral ground where Willow Creek meets the north Platte River." "They'll never agree to meet," Garrett protested. "Too much blood has been spilled already." "They'll come," Catherine said with quiet certainty, "because I'm going to offer them something neither group expects, the truth about who's really been stirring up hatred between our peoples, and evidence that will put the real criminals behind bars." As if to emphasize her words, one of the deputies emerged from Hayes's body with a leather satchel that had been hidden inside his coat. When Garrett examined the contents, his face grew grim. "Letters," he said, holding up the documents. "Correspondence between Hayes and territorial politicians, discussing payments for removing the Indian problem and clearing undesirable elements from prime grazing land. And look at this: orders to provoke incidents between white settlers and reservation Indians to justify military action." Catherine nodded. "My father suspected that the recent troubles weren't random violence, but a coordinated campaign to start a war that would benefit a few wealthy men. Hayes and his vigilantes were just the visible part of a larger conspiracy." The wind was beginning to die down, and the first faint hints of dawn were starting to lighten the eastern sky. The storm that had seemed like it would last forever was finally passing. But Ezra knew that the real storm, the one that would determine the future of Wyoming Territory, was just beginning. "Marshal," he said, "if Catherine says she can prevent this war, then we need to trust her. She's already proven tonight that she can see things the rest of us can't." Garrett looked at the burning remains of the cabin, at the bodies of Hayes's men scattered in the snow, at the evidence of conspiracy clutched in his hands. Finally, he nodded. "All right, Mrs. Coleman, I'll send the riders, but I hope you know what you're doing. If this parley goes wrong, a lot of good people are going to die." Catherine smiled, and despite her wound and exhaustion, there was something luminous about her expression. "Marshal, for the first time in my life, I know exactly what I'm doing. The prophecy is finally becoming clear, and I can see the path forward. But I'm going to need my husband beside me every step of the way." She reached for Ezra's hand, and when their fingers intertwined, he felt a jolt of something, not sight exactly, but a kind of shared awareness that was almost like vision. For just a moment, he could see through Catherine's eyes the snow-covered landscape, the worried faces of the marshals, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. "Did you feel that?" Catherine whispered. "I felt something," Ezra admitted, "like I was seeing through your eyes." "The prophecy is changing us both," she said, "making us stronger together than we could ever be apart. But the real test is still coming. At dawn, we're going to face two armies that are ready to destroy each other. And somehow, we have to find a way to make them see that their real enemy isn't each other. It's the men who profit from their hatred." As the sun rose over the Wyoming Territory, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Ezra and Catherine Coleman prepared for the most important conversation of their lives. The prophecy that had brought them together was about to be put to its ultimate test, and the fate of two civilizations hung in the balance. Dawn came slowly to the Wyoming Territory, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of amber and rose. At the confluence of Willow Creek and the North Platte River, two armies faced each other across a frozen meadow that had witnessed countless seasons of peace until now. On the north bank, 53 Lakota warriors sat their horses in perfect silence, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. They wore war paint despite the cold, and their weapons gleamed with deadly purpose. At their head rode Chief Standing Bear, a man whose face bore the scars of a dozen battles and whose eyes held the accumulated grief of watching his people slowly starve on government reservations out on the south bank. An equal number of white settlers and ranchers had formed in a regular line, their rifles ready and their faces grim with determination. Most were family men, farmers and cattlemen who'd come west seeking nothing more than land to work and homes to raise their children. But months of escalating violence had transformed them into something harder, more desperate. Their leader, a wealthy rancher named Douglas Mitchell, had lost his eldest son to what he believed was an Indian raid 3 weeks earlier. Between the two forces, a small island of neutral ground had been marked with white flags. It was there that Ezra and Catherine Coleman waited, along with Marshal Garrett and 2 of his deputies. Catherine's wounded shoulder was bound with clean bandages, but she remained pale from blood loss and the strain of using her supernatural abilities throughout the long night. Are you certain you can do this? Ezra asked quietly, his hand resting on his wife's good shoulder. Through their growing psychic connection, he could feel her exhaustion, her pain, and underneath it all, her unwavering determination. I have to, Catherine replied. This is what everything has been leading to. The prophecy, our meeting, even Hayes's attack, it was all meant to bring us to this moment. Marshal Garrett checked his pocket watch nervously. They should have been here by now. Maybe they won't come after all. But Catherine shook her head, her enhanced vision already seeing what the others could not. They're coming, both groups. Standing Bear from the north, Mitchell from the south. And they're both angrier than I hoped they'd be. As if summoned by her words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the frozen landscape. From the north came Chief Standing Bear and 2 of his warriors, riding slowly but proudly toward the neutral ground. From the south, Douglas Mitchell approached with his own escorts, their faces set in hard lines of suspicion and barely controlled rage. The 2 leaders dismounted at opposite edges of the island, their hands never straying far from their weapons. The air crackled with tension as ancient enemies faced each other across 20 yards of snow-covered ground. This is a mistake, Mitchell said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. There's nothing to discuss with murdering savages who kill innocent children. Standing Bear's English was careful but precise, learned during his forced education at a government boarding school. White man speaks of murder while his people poison our water and steal our sacred lands. Your son died because you refused to honor the treaties your own government signed. My son died because your warriors butchered him like an animal. Mitchell shot back, his hand moving to his gun butt. Enough! Catherine's voice rang out with an authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her small frame. Both men turned to look at her, and Ezra felt a strange shift in the air around them, as if reality itself was bending to accommodate whatever power was flowing through his wife. Mr. Mitchell, Catherine continued, stepping forward despite her injury, your son was not killed by Lakota warriors. He was murdered by white men wearing war paint and carrying tomahawks, men who wanted you to blame the tribes for their crime. Mitchell's face flushed red with anger. That's impossible. We found Sioux arrows at the scene, war paint on the trees. You found evidence planted by men who needed you angry enough to form this militia. Catherine interrupted. Chief Standing Bear, 3 weeks ago, your scouts reported seeing white men dressed as Indians near your hunting grounds. You assumed they were soldiers trying to spy on your movements. But they weren't spying. They were preparing to commit murder in your name. Standing Bear's weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes sharpened with interest. How does the daughter of Thomas Morrison know these things? Because I can see the truth that others have tried to hide, Catherine replied. And because Marshal Garrett has brought evidence that will prove everything I'm telling you. Garrett stepped forward, producing the leather satchel they'd taken from Hayes's body. Gentlemen, this contains correspondence between a group of territorial politicians and their hired killers. They've been orchestrating attacks on both sides, making each group believe the other was responsible. He pulled out a sheaf of papers and began reading. Letter dated 3 weeks ago from Hayes to Senator William Crawford. The Mitchell boy has been eliminated as discussed. Evidence planted to implicate hostile Indians. Expect militia formation within days. Another letter. From Crawford to Hayes. Excellent work. When Mitchell's force engages the reservation Indians, federal troops will have justification for final removal of all tribes from prime grazing lands. The silence that followed was profound. Mitchell's face had gone white, while Standing Bear's expression remained carefully neutral, though his hands had clenched into fists. You're saying, Mitchell said slowly, that my boy was murdered by white men to start a war? Not just any white men, Catherine said gently. Men paid by politicians who stand to profit from a war between your people and the tribes. They needed both sides angry enough to fight, knowing that when the smoke cleared, they'd be able to claim all the land for themselves. Standing Bear spoke into the heavy silence. If this is true, then the spirits of our ancestors cry out for justice against the real enemies. It is true, Catherine said, and her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. But justice won't come through war. It will come through understanding what we're really fighting. She moved to the center of the island, positioning herself between the two leaders. When she spoke again, her voice took on the cadence of prophecy, as if she were channeling the wisdom of generations. My mother was a medicine woman of the Oglala Lakota. She taught me that every great change begins with a single moment of choice, the moment when enemies decide to become allies against a common threat. That choice is before us now. Ezra felt a familiar tingling as his connection to Catherine deepened. Through her eyes, he could suddenly see the faces of the men around them, Mitchell's grief and rage slowly giving way to dawning understanding. Standing Bear's careful assessment of this new information, the marshal's hopeful tension as he waited to see if peace was possible, but he could also see something else, something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, barely visible through Catherine's supernatural vision, another group of riders was approaching from the west. These were not the farmers and warriors already present, but professional killers, the backup plan that the conspiracy had put in place in case their original scheme failed. "Catherine," he said urgently, "we have company coming." She followed his psychic direction and cursed softly in Lakota. 20 men, heavily armed, riding hard from the west. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. Who are they?" Garrett asked, his hand moving to his rifle. "Crawford's insurance policy," Catherine replied grimly. "Professional gunmen hired to make sure that if this parley didn't end in war, they'd start one. Anyway, the implications hit everyone simultaneously. If the approaching killers opened fire on the gathered Indians and whites, both sides would assume the other had broken the truce. The slaughter that followed would be exactly what the conspirators wanted. "We need to get everyone out of here," Mitchell said, his earlier hostility replaced by grim pragmatism. But Standing Bear shook his head. "My warriors will not retreat from hired killers, and if we run, they will follow us to our families. Then we fight together," Ezra said, surprising everyone including himself. "All of us against the real enemy." Mitchell looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Fight alongside Indians? My men will never. Your men will do what you tell them to." "Do," Catherine interrupted, "if you show them the truth about who really killed your son." She turned to face both leaders, and when she spoke, her voice carried the full weight of her mother's prophetic lineage. This is the moment the old stories spoke of, when the children of two worlds would stand together against those who profit from their hatred. You can choose to honor that destiny, or you can let the real murderers succeed in destroying both your peoples. Standing Bear was the first to nod. "The daughter of Thomas Morrison speaks wisdom. We will fight beside the white men against our common enemies." Mitchell struggled with the decision for a long moment, his face reflecting the internal battle between years of prejudice and the evidence of his son's true killers. Finally, he extended his hand to the Lakota chief. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. How many men do we have between us?" 106 fighters, Standing Bear replied, accepting the handshake, "against 20 professional killers." "Good odds," Garrett said, "if we can coordinate properly." Catherine closed her eyes, and Ezra felt her consciousness expand as she used her enhanced vision to assess their tactical situation. When she opened them again, her expression was determined. "They're going to try to catch us in a crossfire," she said. "They'll split into 2 groups. One will attack from the creek bed to our east. The other will circle around and hit us from the ridge to our west. Their plan is to kill the leaders first, then let chaos do the rest. Can we stop them?" Mitchell asked. "We can," Catherine replied, "but it's going to require perfect coordination between your 2 groups. And it's going to require you to trust my husband's ability to hit targets he can't see." Ezra felt all eyes turned to him, and for a moment, the old familiar shame tried to surface. But Catherine's hand found his, and through their connection, he felt her absolute confidence in his abilities. "I can do it," he said simply. "Catherine is my eyes now. Together, we can put bullets exactly where they need to go." The next few minutes were a flurry of activity as the unlikely alliance prepared for battle. Mitchell rode back to his militia line and explained the situation to his men, showing them the evidence of the conspiracy that had cost them so dearly. Many were skeptical at first, but the documents were too detailed, too specific to be fabricated. Standing Bear did the same with his warriors, though their acceptance of the situation came more easily. Lakota culture had always recognized that enemies could become allies when circumstances demanded it, and the concept of fighting alongside former foes against a greater threat was not foreign to them. Catherine positioned herself at the highest point of the island, where her supernatural vision could cover the entire battlefield. Ezra took up position beside her, his rifle ready and his complete trust placed in her guidance. "They're in position," Catherine said, her voice taking on that distant quality that indicated she was seeing beyond normal perception. 12 men. In the creek bed, 8 on the ridge. They're waiting for a signal from their leader. "Which one is the leader?" Ezra asked. "The man on the ridge, center position, gray hat, black coat. He's got a spyglass and he's studying our positions." Marshal Garrett and his deputies had taken cover behind some fallen logs, their weapons trained on the creek bed. The combined forces of militia and warriors were spread in a defensive line, with Mitchell and Standing Bear positioned side by side in the center, a powerful symbol of their new alliance. "Here they come," Catherine whispered. The attack began with a rifle shot from the ridge, the bullet kicking up snow near Standing Bear's position. But instead of the chaos the killers expected, they were met with disciplined return fire from both white and Indian fighters working in perfect coordination. Catherine's voice guided Ezra's shots with supernatural precision. "Ridgeline, 3rd. Man from the left, behind the boulder." Ezra's bullet found its mark, and one of the attackers tumbled backward down the slope. Creek bed, 2 men advancing on the right flank. 2 more shots, 2 more hits. The battle was brief but decisive. The professional killers had expected to face a disorganized mob torn by internal conflict. Instead, they found themselves caught between disciplined forces that had been warned of their approach and position. Within 20 minutes, it was over. Senator Crawford's hired guns were either dead or in custody, their plan to start a territorial war lying in ruins along with their bodies. The real victory, however, was visible in the way white settlers and Lakota warriors were treating each other, not as enemies, but as fellow survivors of a shared ordeal. "Is it over?" Mitchell asked as the last shots echoed across the frozen landscape. Catherine smiled, and through their connection, Ezra felt her deep satisfaction. "This part is over. But in a way, it's just beginning." She was right. The immediate crisis had passed, but the work of building lasting peace between the two communities would take years. Yet as Ezra listened to Mitchell and Standing Bear making plans for cooperation, for shared use of grazing lands and mutual protection against future threats, he realized that something fundamental had changed. The prophecy his wife had inherited from her mother wasn't just about preventing a single war. It was about creating a new way for different peoples to live together. And at the center of it all was their own partnership, a blind cowboy and a medicine woman's daughter who had learned to see the world through shared vision. "Marshal Garrett," Catherine said as they prepared to leave the battlefield, "there's one more thing you need to know. The conspiracy doesn't end with Hayes and Crawford. My father's evidence includes names of politicians in Denver and Washington who were funding this operation. If you want to prevent this from happening again, you'll need to follow the money all the way to the top." Garrett nodded grimly. "I was afraid you were going to say that. This is going to mean months of investigation, congressional hearings, probably trials that reach all the way to the territorial capital. Then you'd better get started, Ezra said. Because if there's one thing this whole experience has taught me, it's that evil men count on good people being too tired or too afraid to seek real justice. As they rode away from the battlefield toward their uncertain future, Catherine leaned against Ezra's shoulder and whispered, "Can you see it? The world we're going to build together?" And amazingly, he could. Through their deepening psychic bond, Ezra could envision a Wyoming territory where white settlers and native tribes worked together instead of fighting, where his blindness was not a limitation but simply another way of perceiving the world, where the prophecy his wife carried had blossomed into something neither of them had imagined possible. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be more enemies to face, more challenges to overcome, more tests of their faith in each other and in the vision they shared. But for the first time since losing his sight, Ezra Coleman could see his future clearly, and it was brighter than any sunrise he had ever witnessed with his physical eyes. The prophecy was fulfilled, but the real story was just beginning. 6 months later, the first leaves of autumn were turning gold across the Wyoming territory when Catherine Coleman stood on the porch of their newly rebuilt cabin, watching a sight that would have been impossible to imagine just a year before. In the pasture below, white children and Lakota youngsters played together while their parents' former enemies worked side by side to repair a shared irrigation system that would benefit both communities. The cabin itself was larger than their original home, built with help from both Mitchell settlers and Standing Bears people. It served not just as Ezra and Catherine's residence, but as an unofficial meeting hall where disputes could be settled peacefully and plans could be made for their growing cooperative community. The congressman's train arrived this morning, Ezra said, emerging from the cabin with 2 cups of coffee. His movements were sure and confident now, no longer the cautious steps of a man afraid of his environment. The supernatural connection he shared with Catherine had evolved beyond mere survival. It had become a new way of experiencing the world that was richer and more complete than sight alone had ever been. Catherine accepted the coffee gratefully, her other hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. The pregnancy had been a surprise, but a welcome one, and it seemed to symbolize the new life taking root in their little corner of Wyoming. "Congressman Bradley is more nervous than he's letting on," she said, her enhanced perception reading the approaching politician's emotional state with ease. "He knows that what we've built here threatens everything he and his friends have been working toward." The congressional investigation into the conspiracy that had nearly started a territorial war had been making headlines across the nation for months. Senator Crawford was already in federal prison, and several other high-ranking officials were facing trials. But Congressman James Bradley, the man behind much of the territorial expansion policy, had so far managed to avoid prosecution by claiming ignorance of his subordinates' methods. "He can be as nervous as he wants," Ezra replied. "We've got the truth on our side, and the people to back it up." It was true. The success of their experiment in cooperation had attracted attention from newspapers, government officials, and reformers from across the country. What had started as a desperate alliance against common enemies had grown into something unprecedented, genuinely integrated community where white settlers and Native Americans shared resources, made decisions collectively, and raised their children together. But success had also brought new challenges. There were those in Washington who saw their community as a dangerous precedent that might encourage similar arrangements elsewhere. If Indians and whites could live together peacefully and prosperously, it undermined the justification for the reservation system and the policies of forced removal that had made so many people wealthy. "Catherine," a young voice called from the pasture below. It belonged to Sarah Mitchell, Douglas Mitchell's 8-year-old daughter, who was racing up the hill with a Lakota boy named White Hawk close behind her. Both children spoke a mixture of English and Lakota, that had become the unofficial language of their community. "What is it, little one?" Catherine asked in the same mixed dialect. "Papa says to tell you the big man from Washington is asking lots of questions about the school," Sarah panted, having run all the way from the settlement. "And he doesn't look happy about what Teacher Mary is showing him." Catherine exchanged a concerned glance with Ezra. The school was one of their community's proudest achievements, a place where white and Indian children learned together, studying both traditional academic subjects and native skills like tracking, plant medicine, and weather prediction. It was taught by Mary Lightfoot, a mixed-blood woman who had been educated back east, but had returned to apply her knowledge in service of both cultures. "Tell your papa we'll be down shortly," Catherine said. "And ask Teacher Mary to make sure she shows the congressman our students' mathematics and reading scores. He'll have a harder time criticizing the school if he sees how well the children are learning." The children raced back down the hill, and Catherine turned to Ezra with a thoughtful expression. "I think it's time to show Congressman Bradley what the prophecy really meant. Not just that we could survive together, but that we could build something better than either culture could achieve alone." They made their way down to the settlement, where nearly 200 people now lived in a mixture of traditional log cabins, Lakota-style lodges, and innovative hybrid structures that combined the best features of both architectural traditions. The community had thrived beyond anyone's expectations, with shared farms producing surplus crops, craft workshops creating goods that were sold as far away as Denver, and a trading post that had become a regular stop for merchants traveling. Between Fort Bridger and Cheyenne, Congressman Bradley was a tall, thin man with calculating eyes and the kind of polished demeanor that spoke of years in Washington politics. He was currently standing outside the schoolhouse with Douglas Mitchell and Chief Standing Bear, his expression skeptical as he observed a group of children working together on a mathematics problem. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, tipping his hat with perfunctory politeness when Catherine approached. "I've been looking forward to meeting the woman whose unique insights have created such a stir in the territorial capital." There was something in his tone that immediately put Catherine on guard. Through her enhanced perception, she could sense layers of hostility and calculation beneath his superficial courtesy. "Congressman Bradley," she replied evenly, "I hope you're finding your visit educational." "Oh, very much so," Bradley said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I've been particularly interested in learning about the unusual arrangement you have here, mixing races and cultures in such an intimate setting. I'm sure you understand how this might appear to proper Christian families back east." The insult was delivered so smoothly that it took a moment for its full impact to register. But Catherine felt Ezra tense beside her, and she could sense the anger rising in both Mitchell and Standing Bear. "What appears improper to me," Mitchell said coldly, "is politicians who profit from hatred while good people die for their schemes." Bradley's mask slipped slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but surely you can see that this experiment is not sustainable in the long term. Different races are meant to live separately, each developing according to their own nature and capabilities. And what capabilities would those be?" Standing Bear asked, his English formal and precise. "The capability to be cheated out of our lands by forged treaties? The capability to watch our children starve on reservations while politicians grow rich from mining rights?" "Chief," Bradley said with condescending patience, "no one denies that there have been irregularities in the administration of Indian affairs. But the solution is better management of the reservation system, not this dangerous mixing of incompatible peoples." Catherine had heard enough. She stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority that had stopped a war 6 months earlier. "Congressman, you speak of incompatible peoples, but what I see here are Americans. Some were born on this continent, others came from across the ocean. but all of them are working together to build something worthy of this land. Mrs. Coleman, Bradley replied, his voice sharpening, you speak of Americans, but the law is quite clear about who can and cannot be considered citizens. Indians are wards of the federal government, not citizens with rights to own property or make treaties with whites. The law, Catherine said quietly, said that my husband owned me like property when we married. The law said that black men were 3/5 human. The law said that this land was empty when white settlers arrived, despite the cities and farms and sacred sites that had existed here for thousands of years. Perhaps it's time to consider that the law might be wrong. A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the raised voices and the obvious tension. White settlers stood shoulder to shoulder with Lakota families, their children playing together at their feet, their faces reflecting a unity that transcended the artificial divisions politicians, like Bradley, worked so hard to maintain. This is exactly the kind of dangerous thinking that concerns my colleagues in Washington, Bradley said, his composure finally cracking. You're encouraging lawlessness, undermining the proper order of society. This community of yours is nothing but a gathering of malcontents and troublemakers. Troublemakers? Ezra spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made everyone lean forward to listen. Congressman, 6 months ago, this region was on the brink of a war that would have killed hundreds of innocent people. Today, children who should have been enemies are learning mathematics together. Families who should have been fighting over water rights are building irrigation systems that benefit everyone. If that's what you call troublemaking, then I'm proud to be a troublemaker. Through their psychic connection, Catherine felt Ezra drawing on her enhanced perception to read the crowd's mood. What he saw filled him with confidence. These people, white and Indian alike, had tasted something better than the hatred and feared men like Bradley peddled. They weren't going to give it up without a fight. Perhaps, Catherine said, it would help if you understood exactly what we've accomplished here. Teacher Mary, would you bring out the community records? Mary Lightfoot emerged from the schoolhouse carrying a ledger book filled with months of careful documentation. She was a striking woman in her 30s, with the mixed heritage that let her serve as a bridge between cultures. Congressman Bradley, Mary said, these records show that our community has achieved a 98% literacy rate among children and adults, compared to 67% in the territorial average. Our farms produce 30% more per acre than comparable operations, and our craft workshops generate enough income to support families that might otherwise require government assistance. She opened the ledger to show columns of figures that told a story of remarkable success. We've had no violent crimes in 6 months, no disputes that couldn't be resolved through our council system, and no families that have left to return to their previous circumstances. Bradley glanced at the numbers with obvious reluctance. Statistics can be manipulated to support any argument. What matters is the broader principle, the need to maintain proper separation between the races for the good of both. Whose good? Standing Bear asked. The good of the mining companies who want our sacred mountains? The good of the railroad barons who need our hunting grounds? Or the good of the politicians who get rich by keeping us divided? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Catherine could see through her enhanced perception that Bradley was struggling to control his anger, his careful political facade cracking under the weight of uncomfortable truths. Chief Standing Bear, Bradley said, his voice tight, you seem to forget that it was the generosity of the American people that allowed your tribe to survive it all. Without the reservation system, without government protection, your people would have been completely destroyed by now. The insult was so brazen, so historically ignorant, that for a moment no one spoke. Then Catherine stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 7 generations of medicine women. Congressman, My mother's people lived on this land for 1,000 years before the first European ship touched the eastern shores. They built cities, developed agriculture, created systems of government that your own founding fathers studied and admired. They survived ice ages and droughts, wars and plagues, and they would have continued to survive if not for policies specifically designed to destroy them. She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued with devastating precision. The reservation system wasn't created to protect Indians, Congressman. It was created to warehouse them on the most worthless land available while their ancestral territories were given away to railroad companies and mining corporations. And men like you grew rich from every acre stolen and every treaty broken. The crowd had grown larger, and Catherine could sense their mood shifting from curiosity to something harder, more determined. These people had lived through the lies and manipulations that Bradley represented. They had seen their children nearly die in a war created by political greed. They weren't going to be intimidated by congressional authority. Furthermore, Catherine continued, this community exists not because of government generosity, but despite government hostility. Every family here has legal claim to their land. Every business operates under territorial law. Every child receives an education that meets or exceeds federal standards. We're not asking for special treatment, Congressman. We're demanding the rights that the Constitution supposedly guarantees to all Americans. Bradley's face had gone red with frustrated anger. Mrs. Coleman, you seem to forget that Congress has the authority to regulate territorial affairs. If we determine that this community represents a threat to public order, we have the power to disperse it. On what grounds? Ezra asked quietly. On the grounds that mixing whites and Indians leads to moral degradation and social disorder, Bradley snapped. On the grounds that children raised in such circumstances will be neither properly American nor properly Indian, but some mongrel hybrid unsuited for civilized society. The silence that followed was profound and dangerous. Catherine could feel the rage building in both white and Indian members of their community, but she could also sense something else, a united determination that transcended racial boundaries. Congressman, she said finally, I think you should meet someone. She turned and called out in Lakota, and from the crowd emerged an elderly woman whose presence commanded immediate respect. This was Grandmother Winona, Standing Bear's aunt and the oldest member of their community. She was nearly 80 years old, her face mapped with wrinkles that spoke of decades of hardship and wisdom. But it was the child she held by the hand that made Bradley step backward in obvious discomfort. The little girl was perhaps 5 years old, with Catherine's mixed heritage written clearly in her features, native cheekbones and dark hair, but European eyes and pale skin. She looked up at the congressman with the fearless curiosity of childhood. This is my great-niece Little Dawn, Grandmother Winona said in careful English. Her father was white, her mother Lakota. According to you, she is mongrel, unsuited for civilized society. The old woman's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it. This child speaks 3 languages. She can track deer through forest, calculate sums in her head, and recite poetry in English and Lakota. She knows the names of every plant that grows in these mountains and every star that shines in the winter sky. Grandmother Winona released the child's hand and stepped closer to Bradley, her ancient eyes boring into his with the accumulated wisdom of her years. Tell me, Congressman, what civilization is she unsuited for? The one that teaches children to hate each other based on the color of their skin? The one that values profit more than human life? The one that breaks treaties like others break bread? Bradley had no answer. The child continued to stare up at him with those curious eyes, and Catherine could see through her enhanced perception that the politician was genuinely shaken by the encounter. Perhaps, Catherine said into the silence, it's time to consider that the problem isn't with communities like ours, but with systems that require the hatred and separation of different peoples to function. She moved to stand beside grandmother Winona and little Dawn, symbolically bridging the generations and cultures that Bradley sought to divide. The prophecy my mother taught me wasn't about the triumph of one people over another, Congressman. It was about the possibility of something new, a way of living that honors the best of all traditions while rejecting the worst of all prejudices. She gestured to the crowd around them, to the mixed families and integrated community that had grown from the ashes of near war. This is what America could be if we had the courage to choose cooperation over conquest, understanding over ignorance, hope over fear. As if summoned by her words, the children came running from their various games and lessons, white and Indian youngsters together, their laughter filling the air with a sound more beautiful than any political speech. And in that moment, looking at Congressman Bradley's uncomfortable expression as he watched the children play, Catherine knew that their experiment had already won. Not because they had defeated their enemies in battle, but because they had proven that a better way was possible. The prophecy was complete, but the future it had made possible was just beginning to unfold. 2 years had passed since Congressman Bradley's uncomfortable visit, and the world had changed in ways that even Catherine's prophetic gifts couldn't have fully anticipated. Their small community had become the center of a movement that was spreading across the American frontier, inspiring similar experiments in cooperation. From Montana to New Mexico, the morning sun cast long shadows across the expanded settlement. As Catherine walked through streets that now housed over 400 people, her son, Thomas Standing Bear Coleman, rode on her hip, a sturdy 2-year-old with his father's determined chin and his mother's perceptive eyes. The boy had been born during the harshest blizzard in territorial memory, delivered by grandmother Winona, with Ezra pacing the cabin floor and praying to every god he could remember. "Mama, horses coming," Thomas said in the mixed dialect that had become the community's natural language, pointing toward the eastern ridge with the supernatural awareness that seemed to run in Catherine's bloodline. Catherine looked where her son pointed and smiled. Her enhanced vision confirmed what the toddler had sensed: a small cavalry unit approaching under a flag of truce, led by a figure she recognized immediately. "Your father will want to know about this," she told Thomas, turning toward the new council house where Ezra was meeting with the elected representatives of their various communities. The council house itself was a marvel of cooperative architecture, built in the style of a traditional Lakota meeting lodge, but constructed with the precision of European carpentry. It could hold 200 people comfortably, and its innovative design allowed for perfect acoustics even when the building was full. Inside, Ezra was listening to a report from Jacob Steelwater, a mixed-blood man who served as their liaison with similar communities throughout the territory. The supernatural connection between husband and wife had evolved over the years into something even more remarkable, a shared consciousness that allowed them to coordinate their efforts with an efficiency that amazed outside observers. "The Montana settlement is having problems with territorial authorities," Jacob was saying. "Governor Phillips is threatening to revoke their land grants unless they separate into white and Indian sections. What about legal challenges?" asked Maria Santos, a former schoolteacher from California who had become their expert on territorial law. "Federal courts are backed up for months," Jacob replied. "By the time we get a hearing, half these communities could be disbanded." Catherine entered the council house with Thomas still on her hip, and every conversation stopped. Over the years, she had become the spiritual center of their movement, the person others looked to when conventional solutions proved inadequate. "We have visitors," she announced. "Colonel Jameson from Fort Laramie with a small escort. He's carrying papers from Washington." Ezra rose from his seat, his movements still sure and confident despite his blindness. The years had been kind to him. Responsibility and purpose had given him a bearing that commanded respect from both supporters and skeptics. "Official business?" he asked, though he could sense through their connection that Catherine already knew the answer. Congressional delegation arriving next week, she confirmed. 3 senators, 2 congressmen, and a representative from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're calling it a fact-finding mission. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A congressional delegation meant either recognition of their success or an official effort to shut them down. Given the political climate in Washington, the latter seemed more likely. There's more, Catherine continued, setting Thomas down so he could play with the other children who had gathered in the council house. Colonel Jameson isn't just bringing news. He's bringing a proposal. Before anyone could ask what kind of proposal, the sound of approaching horses filled the air outside. Catherine nodded to the council members, and they filed out to meet there. Visitors with the formal courtesy that had become their trademark. Colonel Robert Jameson was a career soldier in his 50s, a man who had spent decades navigating the complex politics of frontier military service. Unlike many of his peers, he had a reputation for honesty and a genuine concern for the welfare of both soldiers and civilians under his jurisdiction. He dismounted near the council house and approached with the measured steps of a man carrying important news. His escort, 4 young soldiers who looked around the settlement with barely concealed amazement, remained with the horses. Mrs. Coleman, Mr. Coleman, Jameson said, saluting formally before extending his hand. I bring greetings from Washington and news that will interest your community greatly. Colonel, Ezra replied, shaking the offered hand. You're welcome here as always. I hope your news is more encouraging than what we've been hearing from other territories. Jameson's weathered face broke into what might have been a smile. That depends on your perspective. The federal government has been watching your experiment here with considerable interest. Some in Washington see it as a dangerous precedent that threatens the established order. Others see it as a potential solution to problems that have plagued Indian policy for decades. He reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio sealed with official ribbons. I carry a formal proposal from the Secretary of the Interior, endorsed by President Hayes himself. The gathered crowd pressed closer as Jameson opened the portfolio and withdrew several documents. Catherine felt a familiar tingling as her prophetic gifts activated, showing her glimpses of possible futures that branched out from this moment, like tributaries of a great river. The proposal is this, Jameson continued. The federal government is prepared to grant your community and others, like it, a new legal status, what they're calling cooperative territories. These would be self-governing regions where white settlers and native tribes could coexist under a common civil authority. A murmur ran through the crowd. The proposal was more generous than anyone had dared hope for, but Catherine's enhanced perception detected undercurrents of complexity that weren't immediately apparent. What are the conditions? She asked. Jameson's expression grew more serious. First, all participating communities must demonstrate financial self-sufficiency within 5 years. No federal subsidies or special assistance beyond what's available to standard territorial governments. That's reasonable, Douglas Mitchell sighed. He had become one of their most effective advocates, using his connections with white settler communities to build support for their model. Second, Jameson continued, all disputes between cooperative territories and standard territories must be resolved through federal arbitration. No independent negotiations or treaty-making authority. Standing Bear frowned. This sounds like the reservation system under a different name. Third, Jameson said, his voice growing heavier, all cooperative territories must agree to accept resettlement of displaced Indian populations from other regions. If tribes in other territories are forced to relocate, the cooperative territories would be expected to integrate them. The silence that followed was profound. Catherine could see through her prophetic vision exactly what this meant. Success would bring not just recognition, but enormous responsibility. They would become refuges for thousands of displaced native families, testing their cooperative model on a scale they had never imagined. How many people are we talking about? Ezra asked quietly. Conservative estimates suggest at least 10,000. Native Americans will be displaced over the next decade as Western territories achieve statehood, Jameson replied. The government needs somewhere to put them that isn't a traditional reservation. Your communities represent the only viable alternative. Thomas Standing Bear Coleman chose that moment to toddle over to one of the young soldiers, offering the man a wildflower he had picked while the adults talked. The soldier, who couldn't have been older than 20, accepted the gift with a bemused smile that transformed his stern military bearing into something almost boyish. "Soldier pretty, Thomas," announced in his mix of English and Lakota, causing several adults to suppress smiles despite the seriousness of the discussion. "Your son has good instincts," Jameson said to Catherine. "Private Morrison there has Choctaw blood on his mother's side, though he doesn't advertise it in military circles." The personal details seemed to break some of the tension, reminding everyone that the political abstractions they were discussing represented real human lives and relationships. "Colonel," Catherine said, "I need to ask you something directly. Is this proposal genuine, or is it a trap designed to make us responsible for problems the government can't solve?" Jameson considered his answer carefully before responding. "Mrs. Coleman, I've been in government service for 30 years, and I've seen plenty of both. In this case, I believe the proposal is genuine, not because Washington has suddenly developed a conscience about Indian affairs, but because your model is the only thing that's actually working." He gestured toward the settlement around them, where white and native families were going about their daily business with the easy cooperation that had once seemed impossible. Every traditional approach has failed. Military suppression leads to endless warfare. The reservation system creates poverty and desperation. Forced assimilation destroys cultures without creating functional citizens. But this— He paused, watching as children of different backgrounds played together in the street. "This actually works. But it also makes us responsible for fixing problems we didn't create," Standing Bear pointed out. "Yes," Jameson agreed, "and that's why the decision must be yours. Accept the proposal, and you'll have legal protection and official recognition. But you'll also have obligations that could overwhelm your resources and strain your social fabric beyond the breaking point." Catherine closed her eyes and let her consciousness expand, using her prophetic gifts to explore the potential futures that stretched out from this decision. What she saw was complex and sometimes contradictory paths leading to great success and terrible failure, often starting from the same initial choices. "I need to discuss this with the full council," she said finally, "and with the other cooperative communities. This decision affects all of us." "Of course," Jameson replied. "You have until the congressional delegation arrives next week to provide an answer. But Mrs. Coleman, there's one more thing you should know." He lowered his voice, speaking with the urgency of a man sharing classified information. "Not everyone in Washington supports this proposal. There are powerful interests, mining companies, railroad corporations, land speculators who profit from the current system of conflict and displacement. They're sending their own representatives to meet with the congressional delegation." "What kind of representatives?" Ezra asked, though Catherine could sense through their connection that he already suspected the answer. "The kind that carry guns instead of briefcases," Jameson replied grimly. "The kind that believe problems like yours are best solved with bullets rather than ballots." The warning sent a chill through the gathered crowd. They had faced violent opposition before, but that had been local conflicts with men like Hayes and his vigilantes. This would be different, a coordinated campaign by national interests with resources far beyond anything they had previously encountered. "How much time do we have?" Catherine asked. "Hard to say. My sources suggest they're already moving people into position throughout the territory. Could be days, could be weeks before they make their move." Thomas, who had been playing quietly with his flower, suddenly looked up at his mother with the preternaturally serious expression that usually preceded one of his inherited prophetic insights. "Mama," he said in Lakota, "the bad men are coming with the storm clouds, but the rainbow children will sing them away." The adults exchanged glances. Thomas's prophecies were becoming more frequent and more accurate as he grew older, though they were often wrapped in the symbolic language of childhood that required careful interpretation. "What do you see, little one?" Catherine asked, kneeling down to her son's level. Thomas looked around at the adults with the patient expression of a child trying to explain something obvious to slow-witted grown-ups. "Many colors together make strong light," he said, switching to English. "One color alone is weak. Bad men think one color is best, so they stay weak." Catherine felt a jolt of recognition as her son's words connected with her own prophetic insights. The child was describing the same vision she had been seeing, a future where the strength of their community came not from uniformity but from diversity, not from separation but from unity. "The congressional delegation," she said, understanding flooding through her. "They're not just here to evaluate us. They're here to see if cooperation really works, or if the old ways of division and conquest are still necessary." A test, Ezra said, his own understanding deepening through their shared connection. "The biggest test we faced yet," Jameson nodded gravely. "The future of federal Indian policy hangs in the balance. If your communities can prove that integration works on a large scale, it could change everything. If you fail..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the stakes. Failure would mean not just the end of their community, but the justification for decades more of policies based on separation, conflict, and cultural destruction. "Then we don't fail," Catherine said simply, rising to her feet with Thomas in her arms. "We've come too far and sacrificed too much to let fear stop us now." She looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, white and native, young and old, born on this continent and immigrants from across the ocean. These were people who had chosen cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice, hope over fear. They had built something precious together, something worth fighting for. "Colonel Jameson," she said, "please tell the congressional delegation that we accept their proposal. We'll take responsibility for integrating displaced populations. We'll prove that cooperation can work on any scale. And we'll show Washington and the world that America's future lies not in division but in unity." The crowd that had gathered around them began to murmur with excitement and apprehension. They were committing themselves to an enormous challenge, one that would test every principle they had fought to establish. But as Catherine looked into her husband's sightless eyes and felt the absolute trust and determination that flowed between them, she knew they were ready. The prophecy that had brought them together had prepared them for exactly this moment, when their personal love would become the foundation for social transformation on a scale that could reshape the American frontier. The real test was about to begin, but they would face it as they had faced everything else together, with shared vision and unshakable faith in the possibility of a better world. The future of two civilizations hung in the balance, and the outcome would be determined by a blind cowboy, a medicine woman's daughter, and the extraordinary community they had built from the ashes of ancient hatred. The prophecy was entering its final phase, and the whole nation was about to discover what happened when love proved stronger than fear, when cooperation triumphed over conquest, and when the children of different worlds chose to build something new together rather than inherit the conflicts of their parents. The storm was coming, but so was the rainbow that would follow it. The congressional delegation arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, their polished carriages looking strangely out of place among the practical wagons and horses of the settlement. Senator William Ashford led the group, a silver-haired man whose reputation for fairness had given Catherine hoped that they might receive an honest evaluation. But as the politicians stepped down from their vehicles, Catherine's enhanced perception immediately detected the presence of others. Hidden among the hills surrounding their community, armed men waited with rifles and dynamite, ready to turn their peaceful demonstration into a massacre that would justify decades of violent suppression. "They're not just here to observe," Catherine whispered to Ezra as they walked toward the greeting ceremony. "They're here to witness our destruction." Through their psychic connection, Ezra felt her certainty about the approaching violence. But he also felt something else, a calm determination that had been building since Colonel Jameson's visit. "Then we'll have to show them something they don't expect," he replied. The morning proceeded with carefully planned demonstrations of their community's achievements. The senators toured the integrated school, where children learned advanced mathematics alongside traditional hunting skills. They observed the council meetings where disputes were resolved through consensus rather than force. They examined the financial records showing sustainable prosperity built on cooperation rather than exploitation. Senator Ashford seemed genuinely impressed, taking detailed notes and asking thoughtful questions. But Catherine could sense the growing tension among his colleagues, particularly Congressman Bradley, who had returned with reinforcements and legal authority to shut down what he called this dangerous experiment in racial mixing. The crisis came during the afternoon session, when displaced families from 3 dismantled reservations arrived as part of the federal resettlement program. 78 men, women, and children, traumatized by forced relocation and suspicious of yet another government promise. "This is impossible," Bradley declared as he watched the newcomers being welcomed by existing residents. "You can't simply absorb this many people without proper segregation and supervision." "Watch us," Catherine replied simply. What followed was a display of organized compassion that left even skeptical observers speechless. Families opened their homes to strangers. Children shared toys and games with newcomers who spoke different languages. Elders sat in circles, sharing stories that bridged tribal differences and cultural gaps. But the hidden gunman had seen enough. As the sun began to set, painting the settlement in golden light, shots rang out from the surrounding hills. The attack was coordinated and vicious, designed to create maximum chaos and terror. This time, however, the community was ready. The years of cooperation had created not just social bonds, but tactical advantages. White settlers and native warriors moved together with supernatural coordination, their shared training and mutual trust allowing them to respond to threats with devastating efficiency. Thomas, despite his young age, stood in the center of the settlement with his arms raised toward the darkening sky. His childish voice carried words in the ancient Lakota dialect, calling upon powers that his prophetic bloodline had channeled for generations. As he spoke, something extraordinary happened. The aurora borealis, normally visible only in winter, and far to the north, began to shimmer across the Wyoming sky. Sheets of green and gold light danced overhead, visible even through the gunsmoke and chaos of battle. The attackers, professional killers hired to destroy a peaceful community, found themselves facing something they had never encountered: defenders who fought not from hatred, but from love, not for conquest, but for protection of something precious they had built together. The battle was over within an hour. The hired gunmen were either dead, captured, or fleeing into the wilderness. But the real victory was visible in the faces of the congressional observers, who had witnessed firsthand what their community could accomplish when faced with existential threat. "Senators," Catherine said as the aurora continued to dance overhead, "you've seen our answer to your question. We don't just accept displaced populations, we transform them into family. We don't just survive attacks, we defend each other with shared courage. We don't just cooperate when it's convenient, we stand together when it matters most." Senator Ashford stared up at the impossible northern lights, then at the mixed families who were already caring for wounded enemies alongside their own injured. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of historical recognition. "Mrs. Coleman, I came here expecting to observe an interesting social experiment. Instead, I've witnessed the birth of something entirely new, a way of being American that transcends the divisions that have plagued us since the nation's founding. He turned to address his colleagues, his voice strengthening with conviction. Gentlemen, we're not just evaluating a proposal for cooperative territories. We're witnessing the emergence of America's true destiny, e pluribus, unum made manifest. Out of many peoples, one nation united not by shared ancestry, but by shared values. The formal legislation that followed would take months to navigate through Congress, but the essential decision was made that night under the dancing lights of an impossible aurora. The Cooperative Territory Act passed by a narrow margin, establishing a new model for American expansion based on integration rather than conquest. Catherine and Ezra Coleman became the first elected governors of the Wyoming Cooperative Territory, leading a community that grew from hundreds to thousands as displaced families from across the continent found refuge in a place where different cultures could strengthen rather than threaten each other. Their son Thomas grew up to become a bridge between worlds even more remarkable than his parents had imagined possible. His prophetic gifts, nurtured by elders from both cultures, helped establish cooperative territories throughout the American West, each one proving that diversity was strength rather than weakness. The prophecy that had brought a blind cowboy and a medicine woman's daughter together had indeed changed the world. Not through conquest or conversion, but through the simple radical act of building something new together, something worthy of the vast and beautiful land they all called home. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of American frontier policy, they would struggle to explain how a small Wyoming settlement had achieved what armies and politicians had failed to accomplish for generations. The secret, Catherine would tell them with a knowing smile, was learning to see the world through each other's eyes and discovering that love, like vision, was something that grew stronger when it was shared. The blind cowboy who had bought a Sioux bride with a covered face had indeed found salvation. But it wasn't the salvation he had expected. Instead of regaining his physical sight, he had gained something far more precious, the ability to see a future where his children and grandchildren would grow up in a world where the color of their skin mattered less than the content of their character, where ancient enemies had become family, and where the American dream belonged to everyone brave enough to reach for it together. The prophecy was fulfilled. The vision was realized, and the rainbow children Thomas had foreseen danced under aurora-painted skies, singing the future into existence with voices raised in harmony rather than discord. In a world that had known too much division, love had indeed proven stronger than fear, and the light that emerged from their unity would shine for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.